dizzy now. The world spun and the ground rose up to meet my face, smashing my nose painfully. My vision began to swim in darkness, and then there was nothing. When the EMTs revived me, the woman's body had already been packed into the ambulance and taken away, though the blood stain remained, a dark stain of brown against the green of the grass. The EMTs said I'd had a panic attack and passed out. The police took my statement and they sent me home, numb with shock. A few weeks later, I found out that the woman had been hit by a stray bullet from someone shooting cans in their backyard a mile away. It was a 1 in a million shot, they said. A week later, I saw the young man again. He wore the exact same clothes, had the exact same haircut and cheerful grin, and the same old-fashioned camera was draped around his neck. I saw him by chance through the window of a restaurant, chatting up an elderly couple who sat in a corner booth. The silent, smiling conversation did not last long before the young man convinced them to get up and move to another booth. He lifted his camera to his face and nothing happened. The old woman smiled and cocked her head to the side as if she was asking him something. He smiled back and raised a finger before lifting the camera to his face again. There was a sound like roaring thunder, and the wall of the restaurant exploded into dust and debris. A truck had crashed through the wall and demolished the old couple's booth. The young man stood there as if nothing had happened. He raised the camera to his face, took one more picture, and then turned to leave. He pushed the door to the restaurant open and walked out. He stopped and scanned the street. His gaze halted on me. The screaming and the chaos faded into silence as his preternaturally blue eyes bore into mine, turning my insides to ice. And then, in a moment, he was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I hoped after that to never see him again, but fate did not care much about my hopes. It never does. I was having dinner with my wife and 5-year-old daughter, Sarah, and the air was filled with laughter and the smell of my wife's baked pork chops and creamed mushrooms. Sarah was telling us a story about a strange man she'd met by the school who had offered to take her picture. She said he had a strange smile and a really old camera like she had never seen before. My heart sat up and began to beat against the inside of my chest. Trying to maintain the illusion of calm, I set my fork down gently on my plate, and I told her that if she ever saw that man again, she was to run, and that she absolutely, under no circumstances, was she allowed to let him take her picture. "But he did take my picture, Dad," said Sarah. "He wouldn't let me see it, but he said he'd come show me when it was ready in a week." "What?" I gasped. My voice was hoarse and small. My wife was looking between my Sarah and I with a look of concerned confusion. Sarah seemed to sense that something was wrong, and her chin began to quiver. "Nothing's wrong, honey," I said. "Everything is going to be okay." The lie struggled out of my throat, and the guilt of it seized my heart and squeezed it tight. Sarah's eyes were watery, but she continued what she was saying. "He said something else too, Dad," she said uncertainly. "He said it was very important." "Yes." "He said he wouldn't develop my picture if you let him take yours. In the park tomorrow at noon." A wave of relief intermingled with sadness washed over me, and a tension I hadn't even noticed dissolved from my shoulders. I could feel the tears starting out in my eyes as I kissed my daughter's head, taking in a huge whiff of her scent, that scent of pure youth that makes the old feel young again. I kissed my wife hard on the lips, savoring the taste, half lipstick and half the pork chops she had just eaten. "I love you, Janine," I said. "And I love you too, Sarah." They looked at me uncomprehendingly, concerned as if I had lost my mind. I've always loved my family more than life itself, and tomorrow at noon, I guess I will have to prove it. Perhaps I can get the better of the stranger, Perhaps not. Wish me luck. You can run on for a long time. Sooner or later, God will cut you down. Johnny Cash. I can't stop, Scott yelled over at me, the yellow Mustang screaming down the Pacific Highway and braking 100 miles per hour. He slammed his foot down to the floor again and again. Nothing. It must have cut the lines, he continued, the panic in his eyes increasing. 107. Fuck. I don't want to die like this, man. I looked over at his terrified eyes and back up through the clear glass. The shocked face of an 8-year-old little boy rushed past us as we continued to pick up speed. 116 miles per hour now. And for the briefest of moments, the pulse of the adrenaline rushing through my body cleared, and a feeling of euphoria washed over me. This felt like a video game, and Scott was pretty damn good at it. An elderly couple, or at least I think they were, in a white van changed lanes without seeing us, and it almost ended for all 4 of us right then and there. Jesus, Scott said under his breath, managing to pull the wheel to the left and barely avoid them while somehow not flipping the car. 125. The euphoric feeling dissipated and the adrenaline pumped back into my heart. Watching Scott swerve and miraculously avoid every obstacle thrown at him, I couldn't help but feel admiration for my friend. There was an icy focus to his eyes now, and he wasn't about to give up. Despite everything that had happened, there would be no surrender. Not yet, at least. Hold on, he said, turning the wheel abruptly to the right and speeding up the runaway truck ramp. 118 miles per hour. I think we're slowing down. 95. Yeah, I think so too, I replied, taking a deep breath. 60. 30. The Mustang rolled to a halt as we breathed a collective sigh and exchanged a look of relief. I put my hand on his shoulder. Good thinking. We got lucky again, man, he replied, the terror never leaving his eyes as he stared over at me. He fought back tears and continued, I can't keep this up forever. And he was right. He couldn't. The brake lines being cut was just the latest incident since he had seen the film only a short time ago. There had been the house fire. Scott had barely gotten out alive, just happening to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning for a glass of water. After 911 had been called and the house had been evaluated, the authorities determined it to be caused by faulty wiring and nothing more. He knew better. There was the near electrocution, the jack stand for his car almost crushing him, and the wolves. I'd rather not speak about that one. What should we do? Scott asked me, the adrenaline dying and a blank stare falling across his face as he gazed out of the car window and up into the thick green trees and surrounding hills. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, and then finally replied, we persist. His exhausted body turned towards me as he dug into his left breast pocket and pulled out a cigarette. He nearly dropped it before gripping the steel handle tighter, flicking the flame and taking a slow drag. You're right. We'll figure this out. Scott smiled. Thanks for being here, Dan. If you ever want to leave, I interrupted. I'm here with you till the end, I replied. He nodded. And then he held his hands around his throat, first puzzled and then terrified. I can't breathe. Help me. Help me. His eyes glazed over, and he went unconscious. I put my ear against his chest and listened to his respirations, shallow yet still there. His pulse was thready and quickening, yet it continued, and as his breathing slowed, I saw the red flashing lights of an ambulance speeding up the ramp behind us. Someone must have dialed 911. You've gotta be kidding me. As a man and woman quickly got out of the ambulance and ran over to us, I readied myself and then exited the car. Help my friend. Scott had been having a terrible time the past few years. His father had died of cancer. He had lost each job he had fought so hard for, and his girlfriend even left him after he had proposed. I had no choice but to kill her later on and bury her body in the hills. I told Scott that she was trouble from the start. I didn't tell the two medics why he had passed out, and I certainly wasn't going to explain how I had laced the cigarette with poison this morning while he slept. I know what you're thinking, and yes, it was supposed to be painless. I just wanted to end his pain. In a way, death had been after Scott. Watching the two medics work desperately to save him, I found a grin falling over my face. He had never shown this type of resilience before, and it was impressive. Still, he had been through too much, and I didn't want him to struggle anymore. And it wasn't like I was just being selfish. With every attempt at Scott's life, I had been planning to die with him as well. That's what friends are for. Yet, each time he had made it. Sure, he survived the fire and what happened before. Yes, he had gotten lucky after I had cut the brake lines. And maybe he would even be saved by the paramedics in these bright green hills before the poison spread completely through his lungs and then into his heart. But I'll get him one of these days. They say you have to make a goal, and no matter what, persist. Well, there's always tomorrow. My work friends and I were at our favorite pub last night. Not a really fancy place, but, cheap beer and close enough to home that I don't have to drive. The night started out normally enough. The four of us crammed into a small table off in the corner, mostly talking shop and shitting on our boss. Being this was the middle of the week, there weren't too many other people around, maybe around 8 or 9 others in the whole place. Everybody just kind of keeping to themselves, sort of people you'd expect to see in a pub on a Wednesday. Anyway, from where I'm sitting, I have a pretty good view of the TV behind the bar. Jesse, the bartender, is kind of lazily flipping through channels and passes by our local news channel. There's a brief burst of orange and red on the screen, which I register as a fire happening somewhere, which then disappears as Jesse switches over to the next channel. Something about the image looks oddly familiar, though. Hey Jess, can you switch that back? I call out to her. The news comes back on, and suddenly I recognize the building in the frame. It's my building, and it's burning. Holy shit, I say, loudly enough that a few people follow my gaze to the television. That's my apartment. The crowd in the bar falls kind of quiet, everybody staring up at the screen now. The screen shows a wide shot of the outside of my building. The camera must be set up on the north end of the block because I recognize a lot of shops on the ground floor. Property management, dry cleaner, convenience mart, etc. The top left corner of the building is aflame. It's not a huge fire by any means, but it looks like a few units between the top 4 floors or so have already been engulfed by the flames. Jesus, man, one of my coworkers says. That sucks. There's an uncomfortable murmur of agreement that passes around the table. I mean, I don't blame them. I wouldn't know what to say in this situation either. Yep, I agree, just as awkwardly. Thankfully, my apartment is only about halfway up and located on the west side of the building. I cross my fingers, hoping my stuff will be okay. The camera cuts to a reporter on the scene. He's standing a little farther away, looking at the shops in the background. I can tell he's across the street on the northwest corner of the building. Firefighters are expected on the scene any moment, he's saying. And hopefully they'll be able to contain this horrible inferno before it spreads any farther. As I was saying before, it's very fortunate that everyone was able to evacuate the building before things got too bad, or who knows what tragic events may have unfolded. He's really laying it on thick, my other coworkers joked. I chuckle a bit. All things considered, at the moment, it really didn't seem all that bad. But then, a few moments later, hang on, the reporter on TV says. We're getting some updated information. It seems, hang on one moment while we readjust the camera. The previously locked down camera starts to shift, the angle focusing on an area of the building about halfway up the west side. All the lights in the building are out except for one. I feel a weird creeping sensation as I start counting the windows from the bottom. 5 up, 2 over. That's my place. I swore I turned that light out, I think at first. Then I see it. There's a person standing in my window. The camera is zoomed out too far to make out any features, but it definitely looks like a man, and it's definitely standing in my apartment. I watch, petrified, as the camera zooms in closer. The reporter babbling on about the overlooked, ill-fated soul still trapped in the blazing such and such. As the image gets closer, I start to make out more details. The person is dancing. Or something. I don't really know how to describe it, but he's moving around a lot, and everything he's doing has this bizarre rhythmic quality to it. He starts waving his arms in the air, back and forth, and then he's waving them up and down at his sides. Then he's banging both fists on the glass. Then he's waving his arms over his head again, back and forth, back and forth. Everything he's doing is to the exact same tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. He starts jumping up and down, waving his arms over his head like he's trying to get someone's attention from a long distance. But everything is to the exact same rhythm, over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. What the fuck? I say, my voice a hoarse whisper. And then the camera gets a little closer. And finally, we can make out the person's features. It looks almost exactly like me. It's wearing the exact same clothes that I'm wearing now, clothes I changed into moments before leaving the apartment earlier. Its face looks almost exactly like mine as well, except for its eyes. Its eyes are far too big for a normal person. It also has this almost comical look of horror on its face. I don't even know how to describe it. Imagine if someone were pretending to look scared, but as a joke. It would have almost seemed funny if the circumstances were different, but instead it was just extremely unnerving. No one in the bar is talking now. Everyone is fixed on the TV. The person is still swaying and waving around, beating its hands on the glass or jumping in circles. I almost don't hear the reporter mention the fact that firefighters have rushed into the building and are now heading for my floor. Oh God, I think, without really understanding what was happening. Please don't go in there. I stare transfixed at the screen. From this angle, you can just barely see the top of my front door through the window, not too far behind where this creature is flailing about. Right now, it's holding its face in his hands and shaking its head from side to side as if saying no. Suddenly, the door behind it bursts open as, presumably, the firefighters have entered my apartment. The creature stops moving. For a second, I see its expression change. The comical look of horror is gone, replaced by a huge smile filled with enormous pointed teeth. Then the lights go out. We all just sat there, staring at the screen as the camera slowly zoomed out from the now dark window. No one says anything as we all quietly pay our bill and leave. I went directly to my sister's place across town and asked to stay with her. I told her there was a fire in my apartment and that's it. When I tried to find footage from the news online later that night, it seemed like they had edited that last part out. I don't know if any of you on the subreddit know what that thing was, but I hope they didn't put out that fire. I hope they let the whole damn place burn to the ground. The children in the town knew better than to cross the old bridge in the park, especially during the evening hours on foggy nights. Even the grown-ups stayed clear, knowing that those who dared venture out were doomed never to be seen again. And everyone knows grown-ups are usually pretty naive when it comes to such matters. They had even made an effort to stop people from crossing the bridge by making a gate that closed every day an hour before sundown to block access to the park. The grown-ups seemed so proud of themselves for protecting the little ones, and so the children didn't have the heart to tell them that it was a waste of money, better spent buying birthday and Christmas presents. Everyone knew better than to cross the bridge, so there was no reason for a gate at all. Unfortunately, Eleanor was nobody, and even if she was somebody, she was still a very stupid little girl. Born and raised in the next town over, little Eleanor had only recently moved when her parents divorced and her father and new stepmother got full custody of her. Though she fancied the idea that she was just too clever to get along with the other children, the opposite was in fact true. She was nearly as ignorant as a grown-up, constantly questioning things and demanding evidence for every trivial truth. Some of the harsher rumors claimed that she didn't believe in ghosts, aliens, or even the completely inarguable fact that the 4th grade homeroom teacher, Mr. Mason, was a werewolf demon hybrid from heck who worked for the devil himself. Thus, Eleanor had rightfully replaced paste-eating Patty as the village idiot. Even so, Eleanor was very prideful. No matter how much the other children chastised her for saying silly little things like, "There's no such thing as baby-biting sewer clowns," she persisted. It wasn't long before everyone started avoiding her, fearing that her blatant disrespect of the supernatural made her dangerous and unlucky. At first, Eleanor didn't seem to mind too much, as her vanity deluded her into thinking that she was better off alone anyway, since apparently she was just so much more intelligent than all the other children anyway. Still, even nobodies get lonely. And so when she heard the other children discussing the matter of the old bridge in the park, she couldn't help but butt in. "Oh, come on. How is a bridge going to eat children? It's just a bunch of stones." The children had heard her say many strange things, but now she had gone too far. Even the grown-ups knew how dangerous the old bridge was. A few of the kinder, more patient ones gave Eleanor a pitiful glance, reminding themselves that she didn't know any better. But while things like Mr. Mason and the sewer clowns were survivable, the old bridge in the park promised at least a bazillion% chance of never being seen again. Sure, the children hated Eleanor, but they wouldn't wish such a fate upon even the worst of little girls. They begged and pleaded with her to drop the subject as she demanded proof, credible sources of information. Some were valiant enough to promise to invite Eleanor to their birthday parties if she'd only promise never to cross the bridge. But stubborn little Eleanor wouldn't listen to reason or bribery. She swore to them that she'd prove that the old bridge was nothing to fear using a hand-me-down video camera she'd received on her 9th birthday. "Tonight I'm going to cross the old bridge," she said, "and then you'll see how foolish you all are." They wanted to stop her from killing herself without putting some effort into trying. Distraught, the sweet and generous children decided they'd try and be nice to Eleanor on her last day alive. All except Patty, who wasn't too keen on being the stupidest child in school again. Eleanor didn't appreciate their efforts. That night, Eleanor snuck out of the safety of her home, biked to the park, and struggled over the gate. Tonight was particularly foggy, and it took her longer than expected to get to the old bridge. Apparently, the gate wasn't the only precaution the grown-ups took. They had also changed the paths around, so that the only way to get to the old bridge was by following the winding deer paths through the marshy woods. It was eerily quiet. No owls hooted and no crickets chirped. Any reasonable person would have recognized the silence as an omen of horrible tragedy to come, but not a girl who denied even the existence of moon vampires. Armed only with her reckless self-confidence and a flashlight, Eleanor walked to her own demise. By the time she found the bridge, it was nearly 10:15, widely known in the town to be the most sinister of times. Obviously, this was true. Why else would the grown-ups rush to their rooms and demand they sleep until the sunrise promised their safety? Eleanor either willingly ignored the time or just didn't know its significance as she turned on the camera. Eleanor gave a cheery smile and said her hellos, almost passing as a normal little girl, until going into a smug little rant about how stupid she thought everyone was, and how she couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces when she proved to them that she was right. She was so self-satisfied that God himself probably considered striking her down with a lightning bolt for being so prideful, but then decided he was better off not wasting his precious time. She lifted her foot to step onto the bridge, but hesitated, as if just for a second the ignorance clouding her mind had cleared. It wasn't too late to turn back. If she chickened out now, the other children would surely only make fun of her cowardice for a few weeks, and as a bonus she'd not suffer what was most likely a horrible death. After an agonizing 12 seconds of thought, Eleanor put her foot down on the stone of the bridge. When she wasn't immediately exploded into confetti or elsewhere injured, she let out a whoop of celebration and started bragging incessantly to her camera. Meanwhile, God was probably reconsidering his leniency. As she walked on, she prattled onto the camera and bragged about how clever she was. All in all, it took nearly 5 minutes of self-righteous babbling before Eleanor realized something was amiss. "This is a very long bridge, isn't it?" Thinking she had misjudged the width of the river, Eleanor peeked over the railing only to see there was nothing below her. "And it's so foggy I can't see a thing. Maybe people have gone missing because they fell off." Despite her efforts to see the river, the fog made it impossible to find it, but it had to be there, right? And so she continued on, every step making her more and more anxious. At this rate, the camera was going to run out of batteries. Any rational person would have turned tail and run screaming like a banshee that had stepped on a Lego. But again, Eleanor hesitated. She checked the time on the watch she had borrowed from her stepmother as if it would tick out. "Nope, everything is perfectly normal. Do carry on," in Morse code. "This must be broken. Surely I've not been walking for a whole 30 minutes. Her panic only rose when she checked to see how long the camera had been recording. Eleanor hadn't pressed the button, and all this time she'd been talking to no one like a complete maniac. Before she had time to swear aloud, her flashlight had the nerve to flicker. Not only had she forgot to record this experience, She'd left her spare batteries at home. Eleanor was in trouble, though she didn't yet realize how much trouble she was in. Even now, she thought the worst that would happen is she'd get lost on the way home without any light to guide her way. Her shoulders slumped, and with a pout, she turned around to head back before her batteries died completely. She felt almost as done as she was, wandering into the woods so unprepared. Cockiness killed the cat, Eleanor supposed, though by killed, she actually meant non-lethally inconvenienced. Maybe she'd try again tomorrow night. It felt like 3 hours passed, but in reality it was closer to 2.5. Eleanor, patron saint of not believing anything without proof, ignored the very real evidence of her stepmother's watch telling her it was nearly 1 in the morning. Unable to control herself anymore, she burst into a sprint and ran as fast as her little legs could carry her, desperate to see the bank of the river. Her flashlight gave out, and so did her confidence. She screamed as loudly as she could and fell into a heap onto the cool stone of the bridge. What was she supposed to do now? Turning back clearly wasn't any good, and seeing as the park was closed, there was no one around to hear her pitiful cries for help. And so, Eleanor gave up. Instead of running around screaming, she opted to just sit there and wait for the sun to come up. Surely it'd be a waste of energy to do anything more. Hours passed by, slower than maple syrup right out of a too-cold fridge. Eleanor did anything she could think of to pass the time. Practice multiplication in her head, figure out what she'd tell her father when he found out she'd been out all night wandering the woods. Anything but acknowledge that maybe she'd never get off this bridge alive. Though instead of fearing monsters, she was still afraid of earthly things like dying of wolves or boredom. To prevent at least one of those things,